Warmly welcome to this first ever Marcus Wallenberg Prize Webinar. We are very proud and excited to have over 300 registered viewers today. My name is Mikael Hannus. I'm the Executive Secretary of the Marcus Wallenberg Foundation for promoting scientific research in forest industry. The webinar series is meant to open an arena for researchers in the prize field to provide their viewpoints on interesting topics that we bring up. We will also make the recording of this webinar available on our YouTube channel. The aim and the objective of the Marcus Wallenberg Foundation is to encourage scientific research by awarding an international prize called the Marcus Wallenberg Prize. The prize is awarded to recognize, encourage, and stimulate path-breaking scientific achievements which significantly contribute to broader knowledge or technical development within the broad fields of interest of the forest industry. In the webinar today, we will dive into the very interesting question of remote sensing of forests and ensuring the correct interpretation by policymakers. And I'm proud to now introduce Annika Nordin. Annika has a background in forest science, and she is board member of the Marcus Wallenberg Foundation. And she has kindly promised to moderate this webinar. So, welcome, Annika.
Thank you, Mikael. I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm delighted to be able to moderate this interesting seminar. First, I'd like to welcome Professor Erik Næsset from the Faculty of Environmental Sciences and Natural Resource Management at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences. Erik Næsset was the Marcus Wallenberg Prize Laureate 10 years ago for his path-breaking research that incorporated the airborne laser scanning method as an integral part of forest inventory. Welcome, Erik.
Thank you very much, Annika, for the nice introduction and also for inviting me to this seminar. I think the topic of today's seminar is really timely, not only to speak about the technological opportunities that we see in forest monitoring, but also to discuss some of the pitfalls. And I'm especially happy that we can do that in a broader context, not just within the scientific community, because I think this also affects and should engage the users of the information that we produce from remote sensing. So let me start with some background here. As we all know, the world's forests are essential for the well-being of our planet and its myriads of life forms and species, ourselves, the humans also included, of course. And there are currently two fundamental and strongly interlinked processes determining the future of our planet, namely global warming and what we call the nature crisis, which is the loss of biological biodiversity. International initiatives address these global challenges. For example, UN conventions on climate change and on biological diversity. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has stated that limiting the global warming to 2 degrees Celsius or below cannot be achieved without substantial contributions of greenhouse gas emission reductions from the world's forests. As a result of the Paris Agreement, many countries, and especially in the tropical and subtropical regions, have identified contributions from their forests to limit the emissions as an important part of their nationally determined contributions. programs under the climate convention, such as the RED program, for example, which aims at reducing the emissions by performance-based payment systems, is identified by the IPCC as the activity with the largest potential for reducing greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, forestry, and other land use. I guess we've all seen pictures like this, showing a fast expansion of logging activities, legal or illegal, in pristine rainforests, resulting in conversion of forests to agricultural land, a process that Europe, for example, went through hundreds and thousands of years ago, or perhaps simply resulting in land degradation and erosion. The outcome is nevertheless loss of carbon and loss of habitat for many life forms. All actions to mitigate unwanted changes in our planet's health status must be based on informed decisions at all geographic levels where decisions are made, from national and international scales where global targets and national commitments are set, to very local scales where the manager is interacting with nature. It's very hard to imagine how we could manage our renewable forest resources unless the decision maker had detailed knowledge of the state of the resources and the potential future scenarios for the resources subject to management. The concern about depletion of the forest resources and its consequences for man's well-being is a more than 2,000 years old story, and it goes at least back to old Greece. We need to take measures. The need to take measures to avoid depletion of the forest resources was evident in European legislation almost 1,000 years ago, and the need for systematic collection of information to act accordingly was acknowledged in Europe already in the 16th century. Some people seem to think that this is what we would need to fulfill our wish to know more about our forests: advanced remote sensing. That may be true, at least if we want to acquire information at reasonable costs, but it also comes with clear requirements and risks and pitfalls that we should be aware of. And we should not forget our history either, which is still highly relevant, which is a topic I will come back to a little bit later. The Nordic countries are celebrating 100 years anniversaries for the National Forest Inventory Program these days. Programs which mark the entry to a new era, scientifically based approaches to rigorous assessment of forest resources. Over the years, these programs have evolved to new technological and methodological opportunities have emerged. Importantly, national programs are nowadays complemented by local forest surveys, providing detailed information for the actual management of the forest at the estate level, sometimes with information about almost every single tree in the forest. In recent years, we have witnessed that nationwide programs with regional and national information targets and more management-oriented local inventories have found common ground. The huge developments of especially remote sensing technology, computation capacity, and advancements of methods have created an unrestricted world of data, where information on single trees or groups of trees can be aggregated to national level in a more or less consistent way. I'm mentioning this historical experience because some seem to think that the emerging remote sensing technologies can replace costly and time-consuming work on the ground. That's unfortunately far from true. In fact, not a single advanced satellite or fancy sensor measure biomass in the forest. Neither do they measure wood volume or tell us if a tree is a pine or a spruce. Only our man on the ground can do that. But advanced sensors can play a great role in improving the resource assessment that you want to do and to reduce costs if the measurements they do make, such as measuring the intensity of reflected sunlight back to the sensor, in some way correlate with the properties in the forest that we want to know more about. Failure to recognize that there is always a risk of producing severely erroneous information from even the most advanced technologies if the calibration of the remotely sensed observations isn't performed appropriately for the specific geographical area for which the information is sought, can lead to huge errors in the description of the forest and in any management decision or policy based on that description. Even scientists sometimes seem blinded by the opportunities that advanced technologies offer. What the guy in the picture can remind us about is that careful measurements on the ground are still required, and that such measurements must be carried out with due attention to a fairly good representation of the geographical area of interest, an idea that the founders of our national forest inventories 100 years ago were so well aware of. So we need to keep this in mind as we discuss all the wonderful opportunities to learn more about our forests that new and emerging technologies indeed do offer. Technology-wise, the advent of airborne laser scanning from aircrafts in many countries in the form of nationwide campaigns with full aerial coverage, and sometimes even with repetition over time, as we have seen, for example, in Sweden, has perhaps been the most amazing game changer in the way detailed forest resource information is provided for local and operational everyday management of the forests. Because lasers can depict the three-dimensional structure of individual trees and entire forests, such data can be equally powerful to produce information about commercial commodities in the forest, like wood, as for attributing properties reflecting climate mitigation potentials. For example, biomass and carbon stocks and uptake, and biodiversity in the form of forest structure and habitat suitability. Likewise, drones with different types of sensors have in recent years become easily available to complement data collection for more targeted, local, and ad hoc information needs in the forest management. For example, identification of need for tending in young forests where costly and time-consuming fieldwork still is standard practice. For larger and perhaps less accessible areas, remote sensing from space platforms such as satellites have made huge progress in recent years. For example, the commercial Planet Labs, operating a swarm of more than 200 microsatellites, can provide daily images with a fairly good resolution, let's say 3 to 5 meters, across the entire planet on a daily basis, providing an unprecedented opportunity for monitoring of disasters and illegal forest activities in, for example, the tropics. The great resolution in time may, in certain cases, also outperform the capability of more fine spatial resolution technologies, such as imagery from airplanes and drones, because many processes in the forest relevant to climate, to biodiversity, and to commercial forestry interests can easily be identified in the temporal signal of the data, such as, for example, insect outbreaks, drought, and wood damages caused by, for example, root. In the same way as temporal resolutional data acquisition programs, from nationwide programs based on aircraft operations with lasers and cameras to satellite-based programs is steadily increasing, we see a rapid development of new sensors and sensor technologies with great potential for characterizing the world's forests. Hyperspectral sensors, rather than more conventional imaging cameras mounted on drones, for example, or aircrafts or aboard satellites, can give essential information on the status of the trees and forests, for example, chlorophyll and nutrient status in the leaves, and perhaps reveal if trees are subject to different stressors way before they are visible to the human eye, even if we are in field. The radar and laser technologies are evolving continuously and find their applications for satellite-based missions. In fact, several of the large space agencies, such as the European ESA, the American NASA, and the Japanese JAXA, have, for the first time in history, recent or upcoming Earth observation missions with specific and dedicated forest and environment targets. Many of these are motivated by the need for more coherent data on the world's forests, and with particular emphasis on the forest role in climate mitigation and in the global climate cycle. Along with the great leaps in recent years in the technological field, new methods to process data and to produce meaningful information about the forests from the primary sensor data have appeared. The methods with roots in disciplines such as physics, signal processing, and mathematical statistics have become easily and often freely available to everybody online on the internet. Machine learning methods and artificial intelligence have found their applications to help producing meaningful forest information. It's easier than ever for anybody to take some data acquired by an advanced Earth observation sensor or a multitude of data from platforms and sensors and transform them into information about trees and forests using some online tool for data processing, often appearing as a black box to the user. Eureka! Look what I found! What a surprise! There is, however, a common denominator for all these sensing technologies and processing tools, which brings it all down to earth. Namely, the need for data collected on the ground, describing the true conditions of the trees and forests. Simple things such as if a tree is a spruce or a pine, how thick the tree stem or the bark is, the age of the tree, as indicated by a conventional coring of the tree stem. In fact, these new and popular techniques, which are on everybody's lips these days, such as artificial intelligence, they are more data demanding to work properly than we perhaps wish that they were. It's really hard to envision a world without a standardized definition of what a tree stem diameter is and how we measure it. So at least in the foreseeable future, it's impossible to envision that the forest can be characterized unbiasedly and accurately without some form of ground calibration. But improved remote sensing technologies and processing techniques can for sure help reducing the need for costly field inventory without losing precision. Traditional calibration against field measurements, as they were conducted by our forefathers when they established the nationwide Forest Service a century ago, will likely be needed in any application aiming at trustworthy description of the state of the forests. So, under such prosperous conditions, where improvements in technology and scientific methods go hand in hand, in the favor of informing forest managers, politicians, and the general public about the huge potential of forests to secure human welfare and combat threats to the health of the planet? What are the pitfalls? What are the limitations? As already indicated, the importance of calibrating all sorts of remotely sent data and data processing techniques against observations on the ground, acknowledged as truth, is likely undercommunicated. We see clear evidence of a naive trust in uncalibrated forest resource information on almost daily basis, in the scientific journals, in the public media, and also in political processes related to use and protection of the forests. We see that even the most prestigious and respected scientific journals fail over and over again by publishing science that should have remained unpublished due to fundamental flaws on the methodology. The journal editors and reviewers fail because they clearly operate beyond their competence. And the latter is particularly alarming because editors and reviewers reflect the general level of knowledge in the scientific community. They are simply just one among us. So this illustrates that usage of remote sensing technology and methods sometimes is out of control. That scientists and users of information do not possess necessary competence to assess the limitations of the appropriate niche for a particular application. Vital researcher or forest manager in previous times had to calculate the amount of the resource by hand, and therefore was acquainted with the basic assumptions of the calculations. And online internet resource utilizing data from most advanced remote sensing technology may nowadays be applied by an inexperienced and uninformed user to calculate the amount of living biomass in another continent far from home. The digital revolution has given everybody easy access to all sorts of information, just a click away. As with all the general information we are exposed to continuously as citizens and consumers, some forest information is what we may call alternative news or even fake news. It's more needed than ever to be well educated and be able to keep a critical distance to any presented information for the really useful and unbiased information to be exploited to its full potential. So education and training in critical thinking among scientists, but also among managers and politicians and even the general public, is perhaps a more limiting factor for successful use of recent technology-driven advances in forest monitoring than the technology itself. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Erik. Very interesting. You describe a rapidly evolving technical development that has huge potential to provide key scientific information for decision makers. But how can it be ensured that decision makers in policy and in practice understand this complicated science and its potentials and also limitations? For a discussion on this, I now like to welcome our panel with representatives from both policy and science. I welcome Anna Holmberg. Anna is in daily interactions with European policymakers as the head of the Brussels office at the Swedish Forest Industries. Welcome.
Thank you.
I welcome Håkan Olsson, Professor Emeritus at the Faculty of Forest Sciences at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. Håkan is an expert in forest remote sensing. Welcome, Håkan.
Thank you.
And I also welcome Göran Ståhl, Professor at the Faculty of Forest Sciences at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. And Göran is an expert in forest inventory. Welcome.
Thanks.
Erik, you mentioned that one of the challenges of bringing remotely sensed data or space-collected data down to Earth, one challenge with that is that there is still a need to calibrate such data with Earth-collected data. But what would you say are the sort of major challenge here? For instance, is there sufficient geographical abundance of such Earth data in relation to the remotely sensed data, so to say? Erik?
Yeah, I think we are in a very fortunate position in Nordic countries in particular, so I can say a few words about that and perhaps take a broader outlook. But we, at least here, we live in what we may call a kind of data-rich environment. We have massive data sets at local level, at national level. They are known to be of high quality, and they can be used to calibrate for a multitude of information products. So I think it's more the competence among the scientists and information producers that is the critical thing here, maybe. But if we go to other parts of the world, or even if we consider Europe as a continent, we will see that ground data are sometimes sparse or non-existing, or that suitable ground data may be lacking because national data are not always harmonized, which is then, as I said, also a case sometimes here in Europe. It's not harmonized among countries. So the consequence under such circumstances could be that the information produced from the remotely sensed data, they are fairly apt in some areas where we do have data, and less meaningful in other areas, or perhaps even seriously misleading. So, and there's also another thing we should be aware of, that the remotely sensed data themselves are not necessarily internally calibrated. So if we look at processes over time, for example, harvested areas of forest, for example, we certainly need both to calibrate for that, but also we need good data to validate such products. And if we look at the European scale, for example, if we don't have harmonized data across Europe, how can we then be sure that what we get is useful and informative and unbiased? I think we need to look at what scale we are operating on and whether we have suitable data for that particular scale. And that's really critical, even in an advanced continent such as Europe.
Yes. Göran, I know that you know a lot about forest inventories, and from a European perspective, as Erik said, we are very well equipped in Sweden, for example, but from a European perspective, the harmonization of ground-based data, can you say anything on this?
Yes, there has been a process ongoing for some time to harmonize forest data, and I think this will continue now with the new forest strategy, it seems so. And many other countries in Europe also have field data like we have in the Nordic countries. But in this type of service, I would like to come back to what Erik stressed about the indirect relationship. We don't see the features we're interested in directly in remote sensing data, but we rely on the model relationships between field truth and the remote sensing metrics. And when we look across larger geographical areas, these relationships may vary. So if you do a large study, a global study, even when you have your information only from some areas, your field information, you may have very poor accuracy in some geographical regions. And I think this is what Erik pointed out in the Eureka image, that in this type of studies, we may run up with very strange results in some cases. Thank you.
Håkan, what kind of technical developments do you see that may help bridge this gap even further?
Yes, first, if we should use this amount of data we have, and many people would like to do that, what you see is things like hotspots for deforestation, approximate extension of forest areas and so on. But as soon, I just agree with Göran and Erik, as soon as you would like to do some type of reliable statistics, you have to have some type of field data. And one way to optimize this and use artificial intelligence more in the future, that is to use harvested data. And that's an opportunity for big forest companies and for forest owner organizations. But for national statistics, I can't really see any other short-term solution than to use the field plots from the National Forest Inventory. Possibly they could be measured more automatically in field, but that is not a game changer. And then on continental level to harmonize the National Forest Inventories. More and more National Forest Inventories are actually putting out rasters of the forest resources that are available as open data. That is one way to distribute the National Forest Inventory results, because National Forest Inventories themselves, the permanent sample plots are not open because they have to be remeasured. The temporary plots are actually open in Sweden, but that could maybe be communicated a bit better.
Yes. Anna, what is your comment on this, that there may be a naive trust in uncalibrated, remotely sensed resource information on forest amongst policymakers in Europe? Do you have any comment on this or example or anything?
Well, first of all, I would definitely agree that many policymakers on a European scale tend to have this sort of naive trust in high-tech space-based data. I would definitely agree on that. And then you should, of course, ask yourself, why is it like this? And we've heard some of the explanations already, that on-ground data differs a lot between member states. So you have to remember that the European Union is a union of 27 different member states. So just because we in Sweden can rely on almost 100 years of history of this sort of on-ground data, that is definitely not the situation in all other member states. And then I think there might be actually one more aspect. I think science-based data to many people sounds high-tech, new and modern, while on-the-ground inventories might feel a little bit like yesterday. We, in this conversation, we all know that that's not the fact, but I think there could be such a tendency affecting policymakers. And you asked for an example, and I would say that a very good one is the Joint Research Center report on forest harvesting levels that came out a few years ago, and where space-based data had been very much relied on in drawing conclusions about harvesting rates in different parts of Europe.
Yeah, that's a good example, I would say. Yeah. I will switch subjects a bit. Traditionally, remote sensing of forests has been a lot about forest cover and forest growing stock volumes. But forests are, of course, recognized also for numerous other values. What are potential major remote sensing technological advances in these fields? Håkan, I will start with you.
Yeah, first we have laser scanning data now, and For example, in Sweden, we have a second round, and in Finland as well. So this development that we will have time series of three-dimensional data, laser scanning and photogrammetry, is of interest both for forestry but also for carbon accounting, that we can see if the growing stock in the forest is increasing or decreasing just by following 3D data over time. Then I think one interesting example is that the laser data we have got nationwide in many countries. In the case of Sweden, it has been used for constructing a model of soil moisture that is actually the most downloaded data set of these raster data sets that we are producing. So, and that helps to do the forest operations more, the damages on the soil will be reduced by these maps. So then, of course, we have other things like biodiversity, and we could see the structure and the extent of different habitats, but still it is, again, every information about species and so on, that has to be collected on ground. So remote sensing could make things more efficient, but again, ground information is very important for example, biodiversity.
Yeah, I would agree. Erik, do you have any comment?
Well, I think much was said already by Håkan. I think the principal thing here, why we believe that remote sensing can help with other things than just wood volume, which is a more traditional parameter, is one, like Håkan actually mentioned, that we have sensors and technologies that can give the three-dimensional structure of forest, which then obviously, and then one can just imagine what ecosystem services have a kind of relation with three-dimensional structures. Clearly biological diversity and many other things. That's one principal aspect of remote sensing that can help to find information about other services.
Yeah.
The other thing is temporal scale. That we if we have daily acquisitions of data, so to speak, many of the processes and many of the phenomena in forests, they are temporal. For example, growth or how things changes during a growth season. So I think these are the principal aspects of the emerging remote sensing technologies that can bring us a step further regarding many different services, actually, that we would like to characterize.
Yeah. Göran, since you know a lot about ongoing inventories, do you see any novel inventories that would be needed to further develop monitoring on forests values like biodiversity and other ecosystem services, or I mean, there are also ongoing monitoring that perhaps is worth mentioning.
There is a lot of developments, and as Håkan and Erik has mentioned, we can do a lot, I think, in a short while with remote sensing data for basic forestry operations purposes. But then with the broader environmental monitoring, that may not be so. We need to identify species, etc., on the ground. So there's a lot of development, also field-based methods that are needed. For example, environmental DNA-based methods and things like that is developing in parallel with the remote sensing development. I think this is important. We will not be able to do everything with remote sensing that is required from different monitoring programs. But also what you asked for, maybe we need to measure things differently for the model. Maybe we need to base our models on what we can see from the remote sensing, like basing models on crown diameter rather than stem diameter and things like that. And this is ongoing to think new a little bit, to utilize the full potential of remote sensing data.
Yeah, what you're saying is really that we can use remote sensing to direct on ground inventories, and then that we can use molecular techniques even to do new sort of inventories of different species that are not so easily seen, for example.
Right. When we look at the broad range of inventories that we do today, it will take a long time before we can do everything with remote sensing, perhaps not ever. And I think the development of field-based methods is also very important, like environmental DNA-based methods.
Anna, do you have anything to add to this technical discussion?
Well, from an EU policy perspective, I would say that more accurate, more uniform data on biodiversity in forest would be very, very beneficial. I experience today that too much of the EU biodiversity policy discussion is based either on the global situation, and we all know that that is a very challenging one, and that the global situation is sort of put as the framework for EU policy discussion, or it's based on the member state reporting on biodiversity, and we know that that differs quite a lot between member states. So here I think that science-based, trustworthy data on the development of biodiversity, especially trends over time in forests, could be very beneficial for the policy discussion.
Yeah. Yeah, you envision a new seminar, in fact. This is such an interesting topic that you're mentioning. Moving on to the question on how correct interpretation of science can be ensured amongst decision makers. Within this subject area we're discussing here today, remote sensing of forests, what would you say are the major challenges? Anna, again.
Well, I would say that the major challenge is to be able to bring the scientifically based results to policymakers in such a manner that it is truly understood. You have to recall that very few policymakers have a strong scientific background themselves. They might be very highly educated, but they have not done the type of research that we're talking about here today. And to be able to convert the scientific results into something that actually almost the man on the street can understand, and thereby it can be applied in policy, because policy is about politics, and the dynamics of politics is very different, I believe, from the dynamics of the scientific community. So there is a big challenge there to sort of convert things into applicable, understandable things that can actually be applied.
Erik, you mentioned in your seminar that even scientists can be sort of not undereducated, but perhaps going into interdisciplinarity in a way that is not totally according to the result that they try to acquire. What do you see as potential solutions to that? Should we educate scientists even further, or should we train them to work together better, or what can we do?
Yeah, I guess both are needed. The challenge for science, of course, is that, especially in this field, we are talking about technology, remote sensing technology. We are talking about new methods that comes from other disciplines. I mentioned physics, statistics, etc. For example, artificial intelligence. Does a good old forester know what that is and the preconditions for that to work successfully? And we have already said that we need still to have good data on the ground. So the number of disciplines or the knowledge that the scientists in the field need to have is increasing all the time, and that's a challenge. It's a challenge for our PhD education. It's a challenge for even established researchers to take on all these new things that come in. So clearly collaboration across disciplinary boundaries. But I think the most important thing is that the researcher who is hands-on with the analysis needs to have a full understanding of all parts of the play, the data, the techniques, and of course also the field side. So yeah, we just have to cope with that, the challenge. Otherwise we can, as I said, really mislead people with what we produce because we cannot really trust it.
Yeah, it's about being aware of limitations perhaps also. Håkan, I would like to ask you, I mean, there's some kind of competence gap between science and policy, and perhaps also between science and practice. And what kind of translational competence could we use here? What can policy do? What can practice do? What can science do?
Yeah, I think what you said before is important, that to communicate limitations. That's maybe the thing we can do in practice. I mean, there is a lot of scientists that would like to do global analysis and that are lacking the field data for that, and we can't really stop them. But we have to communicate the nature of different types of analysis. You might see hotspots for deforestation, but you can't really tell the exact areas without knowing which type of forest that is growing in that part of the world and so on. So communicate limitations, all types of metadata. And another thing is to also encourage all types of compilation of science, like review articles and panels like IPCC and so on. So there is a lot of single studies that you can cherry pick if you are some type of policymaker, but we have to look at the broad picture. I stop there.
Yeah. Finally, I would like to ask a bit about arenas for scientists to interact with policymakers and practitioners, arenas for dialogue and collaboration that at the same time minimizes the risk to compromise the independency of scientists and the integrity of decision makers. I would like to ask Anna about this first, and then I will give the word to Göran to round this interesting question off. Anna.
Well, thank you. Well, first I'll make a bit of a distinction between policy and politics. I mean, policy is the development of policy, while politics is the tactics on how you get the result that you want, for instance, in a political environment. And I think for scientists, I would love to see more of interaction with Nordic scientists, or at least scientists with strong knowledge about boreal forests in policy development. That could mean interaction with the European Commission, for instance, the Joint Research Centre. Then I have a strong understanding that many scientists might be reluctant to get into the politics of things, meaning the tactics of how politicians actually play the game at the end of the day. And I fully respect that. But by making this distinction between policy and politics, I think that could be a first step. But we need, in Brussels, where I'm based, we definitely need to have more engagement in policy development of researchers with a strong knowledge about conditions in boreal forests.
Thank you. Göran, what are your ideas on what kind of arenas we could use for interaction?
I think we need many different arenas, and we're all the time discussing the science policy interface in different contexts. I think we have mentioned already these organizations like IPCC, IPBES, and these type of larger science communities interacting with policymakers. I think that is one important example, but there are many others as well, and how we work at universities. We, in Sweden, for example, in my university, we try to bring scientists and policymakers together in what we call future platforms to discuss current policy and politics-related issues related to forests, for example, and other areas as well. So I think it's not just one arena, of course, but many different arenas. And sometimes it's sensitive how scientists and policymakers interact. In other cases, it's not sensitive at all. I mean, to discuss scientific development in the area of remote sensing with industry people, it shouldn't be sensitive at all. I mean, this is how we make things more effective for forest industry, so that shouldn't be sensitive. In other cases, when we advise on what are the relevant measures to take to run forestry for mitigating climate change, that is more sensitive, for example. So it's a big and difficult question. We need many arenas, and we need to act slightly differently in the different arenas, I think.
Thank you. And by that, I will end this panel discussion. And thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and ideas on these important matters. Mikael, I will now give you the word to you.
Thank you, Annika.
Round this off.
Thank you, Annika. And thank you very much, the eminent panel. and very good moderation, Annika. So it's time to wrap up, and I hope you have found it interesting and gained new insights on based on the discussion in the panel and the presentation by Professor Næsset. Maybe we never can learn all aspects of these challenges, but every step forward means a better interaction in the discussion between science, industry, policymakers, and as Anna pointed out, all the way to politics. I think we need to look for how the translation evolves and follow it also in respect of the Marcus Wallenberg Prize webinars, and look into new topics. So as I also said before, this webinar will be available on YouTube, and you will receive an email with a link to the YouTube channel and this webinar, and a short feedback form. So please take a little bit of time to fill that out. It's short, I promise you. I have secured that it's short, so you will give us the correct feedback. And I would also like to ask all of you participants, not only Annika and the panel, but all the listeners, to be active in this area. And we are very open to getting input from you also on interesting topics and suggestions for future webinars. So until we inform about the next webinar, stay tuned for other messages from the Marcus Wallenberg Prize. Thank you and have a really, really nice autumn.